Darren will edit that.
Edit it all out. It's going to be great. Hi, everyone. So welcome back to our third and final part of this session. As I said right at the start, Maria agreed to jump in at the very last moment and fill in so we could put on a full roster of speakers today. So thank you so much, Maria, for doing that for us. If you didn't get a chance to see the recording of Maria's session from CALC 2021, I'm going to say, you will find it in an email as well. And definitely, if you haven't seen it before, it's really worth watching. It's a really good session. But we're going to be chatting a little bit about that today. So Maria, how are you doing? I know you said you've been on campus all day today. Bit tired.
Fine. We're here.
I feel like we're continuing on this session today. We're slowly working our way northwards. So I think we started out in Gloucester and Derby, then up to Manchester, and now we're all the way up to Edinburgh. So yeah, heading steadily north. So first question that I had for you is, like I say, you presented at CALC 2021. Could you give us a bit of an outline of what your session was about and what it involved, particularly for those who might not have had a chance to watch that recording?
Yeah, so it was about punk pedagogy, and I basically gave an outline of what that is and then how it influences my practice. So just to give a bit of a quick overview of what it is for anybody who might not have attended that session or had time to watch the video today, it's a form of critical pedagogy that has quite common principles with both constructivism and social constructivism. So it's all about being really learner-centered, independent learning. So independence is a really key element of that. But also things like collaborative and peer learning, the instructor being a facilitator, and this idea of co-construction of knowledge, and learners are also teachers and so on. And then some of the really sort of like key elements that might make it a little bit different. There's no sort of one definition as such, but different scholars within this sort of field have identified things like DIY, thinking for yourself, but this really key element of about rejecting sort of traditional modes of thinking, and the sort of challenging that status quo, questioning authority, rejecting, that kind of sort of expectations in some ways of certain elements of teaching and learning as well within an educational setting, and elements of like deciding how you want to learn and taking more of that ownership of your own learning as well.
Yeah, and I get the sense from punk pedagogy as well, from the bit of reading and talking to you about it as well, that it's almost defined by that, not having a set of rules about it. This is what punk pedagogy is. It has to have this, because it's about rejecting that kind of not all the rules, but about being individual as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that whole nature of it, like, people will sort of interpret it slightly differently, or may have sort of elements that they might stress more, particularly within their own practice or sort of the scholarship that they're writing about it and within certain contexts and so on. But yeah, it's that sort of element of there isn't necessarily a right or wrong answer here. It's up for development, it's up for change, it's up for like what you want to bring to it and what you want to make of it.
And you talked a bit in that presentation about how you incorporated punk pedagogy into your practice. Could you give us a couple of ideas, just for those that might not have seen that, about ways that you have used punk pedagogy for teaching? Yeah,
so in terms of what I sort of covered in the original presentation, there's a few different sort of elements. So one of those was about sort of my role as an educator and about how I then incorporate that into my own practice from more of a sort of like a personal side. So things like reflecting on my practice and how I incorporate opportunities for students to provide critique, but not only necessarily on, say, the content of a session, but actually my role as an educator. And I think since, like I gave some examples of how I did that like last time, and since then I've been trying to do this in more of a formal way that can be used I suppose richer data, I guess, but in a way that can be used for like research purposes. And I've been working with an academic colleague for at my new institution, to get some feedback about a really specific module and like tailoring that feedback to then influence and feed into more large scale changes about how my support on that particular module is delivered. Some of the ways it's sort of changed as well, there's a couple of things that have changed that I talked about in the original presentation. So at the time of the presentation, I worked somewhere else, and I was a module leader on like a skills module that sat like alongside the academic programs, and students had a choice of modules that they took. Now I'm no longer in that job role, so some of the things I talked about in my initial presentation were very sort of connected to that. So I would say that some of the things I no longer do. However, what I would say in my current role is I probably have more influence and integration in academic modules and embedded programs than I did in my previous institution. So one of the things I was talking about previously was providing formative feedback, which is something that I had control over within my module as a module leader. But even though I've not got that necessarily that control as like the module leadership position, I would say I'm now far more closely embedded in courses to be able to build in some real worthwhile and sort of like real activities around formative feedback, which are supported and endorsed by the module staff. So for example, in the master's dissertation modules, they have a formative assignment, which is to submit a search strategy, which I then read and give feedback on, which is something that I don't think I would ever have been, closely embedded enough at my previous institution to sort of have that much responsibility, if you will.
Wow, that sounds really, yeah. So I guess it's that difference, and it's something, we used to work together. I've had the same thing before. When you have that module that belongs to you, you do everything that you want with it. Once you're more about an embedded teacher, it's one shot, you have less control of that. This wasn't on my list of questions, but I'm really interested in that point you raised there about giving formative feedback. Do you think there is a punk way of giving feedback, or the one that fits in with your punk pedagogy, that you give feedback that might be different to how people would?
I think a lot of it is around sort of the student ownership of it, because I think the idea and the nature of formative feedback is that it's optional in some sense. They're not being marked on that. So if you choose not to hand that formative assignment in, you just don't get that formative feedback. So in a way, like the way they do it here is there is absolutely no penalization for not handing in a formative piece of work. It has no impact. But what is really sort of explained to the students is you are losing out yourself because this is your opportunity for feedback. So explaining why students need to take that ownership of their own learning and the ownership of the opportunity to reach out for this and submit something that will be given feedback, it's then pushed a bit back on that sort of student. So it is this kind of thinking for yourself, do it yourself. You do have to take that initiative to put that work in to get something back. And, it works both ways. We're going to help you, but you have to help yourself, and you have to help us by giving us that at a time that works for us so that we've got the time to then provide that feedback. Don't come to us a week before and expect draft feedback, because this is when we have time in the timetable. So it's that kind of like do it yourself to an extent, but also this kind of like it's on both of us.
Yeah, I really like that idea that you're talking there about how using an opportunity to formative feedback is about having ownership and about you using it. And I guess what I'm thinking is just saying that as well. It changes that relationship between the sort of teacher and the student almost, because it's like, no, I'm not going to give you all the information. I'm a resource. You can use me or you can not use me if you want to. It's really on you about how you want to do that. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and I think generally sort of that's a bit of more of an attitude that I've come across with like academics as well. That's sort of a standard attitude to formative assignments, and it's very much pushed back on the students as fine, don't do it if you don't want to, but that's you missing out on an opportunity for something valuable for you.
I think, yeah, that's really interesting. And I think it's also really challenging for students because they are not used to working in that way. And I think we see that probably a lot across all of the universities that we work at, is that students come from school and they expect to get work in a particular way, and there's that power dynamic of like, that person is the educator, they're going to give us stuff, and everything is geared towards the assignment. So yeah, how have you found like that kind of the reaction to the formative assessment? And I was actually also going to ask about like, how did you find sort of marking the zines, and did you find any like really good examples? What were the kind of outcomes of the zines that were handed in?
Yeah, so I think in terms of like the first part around like student reactions to that, I think you're right that for some students that's really new. I think the nature of the programs I work in, so similar to Ramona, I'm a health and social care librarian. And a large number of students on my programs are mature students. They're coming from the workplace. We have quite limited numbers, like in terms of comparison to other programs and other schools, we have way more students who are coming later in life. And I think potentially that in itself, then you're not just coming straight from school. You've got experience in the workplace and experience of how feedback might be sort of more two-way, and how it sort of works differently in different contexts and things like that. But I think definitely some of the programs where we have like fully international students, I think that's definitely a bit of a more of a culture shock from their perspective. And some of those programs are the ones where we have the least engagement with formative. And it's almost like giving the opportunity to not do that, then that's maybe seen as a, oh, I don't have to do this. And there might be a slight misunderstanding there in terms of just because you don't have to do it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. So I do think that needs some, better explanation, encouragement, and maybe actually should be more stressed as do this for certain groups who might not, really get the benefit if that's something that they're really not used to. I think the concept of formative and summative to certain students, whether it's, they're coming straight from school or whether they've come from different educational cultures, is new within itself.
Cool. So when you were talking about punk pedagogy to CALC back in 2021, it's a couple of years ago, lots has changed since then. So I was wondering if there's anything that you'd either seen other people doing or seen presented at a conference or read anything that sort of influenced your teaching practice since, or that you found fits in with what you do.
Yeah, so I think one of the other key things that I talked about back in 2021 was about how I then use sort of and teach criticality, and primarily I'm teaching criticality to students. But a couple of the things that I'd attended, so I think some people here might have attended Lilac earlier this year. A couple of those keynote presentations, so there's Marilyn Clark and Emily Drabinski, who both had topics which really fit in with sort of a critical approach to libraries. And I think they were talking a lot not only about, criticality with students, but about criticality across the institution as a whole and with other stakeholders. And that really got me thinking about, well, I could maybe talk about something to students, but then they're still submitting assignments that maybe haven't been developed from that same critical approach. So how does then what I'm saying even make a difference? So one of the new workshops that I'm developing at the moment to deliver to academics is about critical approaches to information literacy. And it's going to cover things like asking them to question how information is created and published, so addressing bias and inequalities, and therefore which voices do we hear or don't hear, and how this then impacts what guidance they give to students and how they mark assignments. So for example, I've seen assignments in my like school that say you must use peer-reviewed journals only, you must use journals that have come from this specific database, only use the library catalogue. So when they're then giving this kind of guidance, they're limiting the voices who could potentially be included within those assignments. And something else that I'd picked up when I did my original presentation was about where students' views and practices clash with staff expectation and views, especially in sort of the area of criticality. And I'd like to sort of unpick that. So really sort of say to them, if you want them to do independent research, why are you then putting so many restrictions on whose views are going to be found via the approved search locations and methods? So we'll see how that training session goes down.
That sounds absolutely fascinating. Like CALC 2023, Maria's good in. Yeah, that sounds really interesting. I mean, I did a staff training session a couple of months ago, which was similar, but it was almost the step in before that, which is just like, oh, how bad is the world of research, and why all the research comes from a tiny geographical location, and has all these biases in, and what's the problem with the research databases that we currently recommend. And it sounds like you're taking that the next sort of step on and linking that bigger picture into students' actual work. So yeah, that sounds really cool. We'll have to chat and catch up with that. That sounds cool. So maybe this is more about sort of the way that you're doing your teaching. So I think, if I remember rightly, from back in 2021, you were doing most of your teaching online still. We were still in, quite deep into the pandemic. Has that changed for you? Are you doing mostly face-to-face now, or is it a mix? What's the setup for your teaching now?
So I think Scotland generally went back to face-to-face teaching a lot slower than England did. So at the point when I did my presentation last year, I just started my new job in Scotland, but I was actually still living down in Birmingham. So I was working online because I was not physically there anyway. But actually, even trimester 1 last year, we were still doing most stuff online. Like, the campus was quite quiet. Trimester 2 went back to more sort of in person. So what I'm doing at the minute is still quite a mix. Some of the programs in my school and that I support are actually fully online programs, and have always been and will always carry on to be. And then there's also, so we are the largest health school in Scotland. So we have like 700 undergraduate nurses every year. So for things like lectures, they used to just split them into 2 groups and put them in a massive room. So what they've decided is actually they're just going to keep lectures online because there's no real difference. But then anything like that's more like workshopy and tutorial based seminars, all of that is in person. And then some of our other programs have gone back to like fully in person. And I think some of those decisions have been made around actually engagement massively dropping when everything switched online, and grades dropping when everything switched online. So I think there's some sort of individual decisions in there. But one of the decisions I've personally made is about anything that I do that's an optional workshop, I'm going to keep those online. And partly that's come from, overwhelmingly positive feedback from students about preferring them online, because I tend to do that. Well, I purposely schedule them on days where there is no embedded teaching in the school. So that means that students can just pick it up from home, potentially from work at a lunchtime. They can watch recordings, and the recording, within the feedback, there's loads of comments about how useful the recording is and being able to watch that back. And I think that's another really key part of punk pedagogy, about this idea of flexibility. And for me, anything that's optional should be available to anyone who wants to access it whenever they need to access it. So that sort of flexibility of engagement with any of my sort of online workshops, whether it's interactive learning objects, videos, all of that kind of thing, giving them a variety of options. And I think the sort of the teaching online bit helps in some sense with that, because it is much easier to provide a recording. And I even say to students, if you know you're not going to be able to attend, still sign up because you'll get access to the recording. And I know some people might be thinking, oh, but you might not get them live. I'm not bothered. If that's what works for them, fine. You know, there will still be some people who prefer to have it live and they will turn up. But forcing people to have to pretend like to attend in person and then sort of just sit there quietly in the chat, that benefits no one. So, you know, I'm happy with the engagement that students want to do. And I think I'm now increasing the amount of options for students to engage with content. So making loads of improvements to like the online information, more videos, more interactive learning objects, still got the live workshops. You can still drop me an email. You can still come and have a chat with me and we'll sit in the cafe downstairs. So really giving that sort of flexibility of engagement for students, and then they can sort of work out what fits them. So it's more of a give students the option of what works for them from my perspective.
Yeah, and I think that's really interesting. I can share a lot of those experiences, but yeah, having a mix of options for students and letting them choose, because it's very easy, particularly as us as educators, to assume, oh well, this is the way I like to learn, so therefore this is how I'm going to do it. In the same way that, you know, other approaches to learning, we often think, oh, this is how I like to do things, or I like it really active, loads of activities, and if they're not constantly doing something, they're not engaging. Whereas actually, yeah, there is other ways to engage with sessions as well. And sometimes, I don't know, I've had experiences where you come to do an online session, it's a lecture, and if nobody shows up, I think this is even what Laura's saying, if there's nobody there, then you just do the recording as though there was. It doesn't really matter. You know, you had to record it anyway. Yeah, so that's really interesting. Yeah, that you still maintain that. You mentioned a bit in your talk about how punk pedagogy blurs the line between the educator and the student. Do you think that still works online, or does it work differently than it does in person?
I think it works less online, because I think like you tend to have maybe like a situation like we've got right now. There's you and me with our cameras on who are the clear presenters, and then there's other people who are clear audience members or participants. And I think that when you're in an online space, unless you start using breakout rooms and you're very much sort of separating people out, that's then, you know, very hard to recreate. Whereas in person, if you're sort of doing an activity, it's a lot easier to sort of, yes, you might have to do some things where you stood at the front of the room, but you can really use the space differently and maybe like move around a lot more, sit with a group and talk to them, so that if somebody walked in that room, would they be able to immediately tell who the sort of the teacher is? So I think it is easier to sort of physically and visibly blur those lines in person. But then I think there's some sort of like peer activities that I think is easier using online tools and even asynchronous. So like one of the things I do is when it comes to like searching and search strategies, ask the students to come up with words that they are struggling with, to say find alternative terms, post them on a Padlet, and then other students in the group go in and post alternative words that they can think of. So it's sort of like encouraging this view that just because I'm stood at the front of the room doesn't mean I'm the most expert person in this topic. And actually, when it comes to content knowledge, you're more experts than me because you're working in this industry or you're studying this content, and somebody else in the class could be, you know, a real expert in this area and have loads of suitable alternative suggestions they could put forward. And I think sometimes, yes, you could do that in a physical room and you could use post-it notes, but I think often the benefit is I will leave things like a Padlet up like that and say, have a look in your own time, have a look later on, have a think about it. You don't have to come up with an answer right now, but I'll leave it up there for a few weeks and you can then access it again when you need to put that search strategy together and see what's been written on there. So it's just that kind of blurring the who's the expert here sometimes as well.
Yeah, I really agree with that. I think in a synchronous like this, it's really clear what everyone's role is. I mean, you literally have your role next to your name, that you're a moderator or a speaker and everyone else is an attendee. And yeah, it's difficult to break that. And actually, if you've ever been to a session where everybody's made a presenter or a moderator as soon as you go in, it's chaos and it's awful.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because the way that I run my workshops is via Teams, and I just send an invite to everyone and it automatically gives everyone the same permissions.
Wow.
And one of my colleagues was like, oh, but that'll cause madness. And I went, well, it hasn't so far. And I've only realized that everyone's a presenter because you asked me about it. So I said, I've been doing it for a year and it's totally fine.
Maybe it's just the librarian CPD sessions that I go to that we're can't be managed. We've all been made a presenter. But yeah, it's that difference, and I think totally agree with the asynchronous stuff. It is less clear who's in charge, and everyone's got that equality. And I think the other bit as well is just that people have time to sit and reflect on things. I mean, particularly when I've done coming up with keywords with students, you're saying, right, on the spot, here you go. You've got to tell me 5 ways of saying this term. And it's difficult. And actually, if you give people that time to reflect on it and to look at what the people have got, they've got more options to take a leadership role as well. So next question I had was, you talked in your presentation about punk being a frame of mind. So you don't have to identify as a punk, it's a way of thinking. And that it's about questioning conventional thinking and challenging power structures. And I think my opinion is that libraries are perceived as being, and they can be quite conservative with a sort of small c. Do you think that punk frame of mind, that questioning frame of mind, is becoming more widespread in the profession? And have you got any examples that you think of, if you do?
I mean, in terms of examples, I think both of the other presentations from today fit into that mindset. Like the first one is basically about, the librarians taking on the publishing giants. Like that in itself is a massive example of sort of really sort of questioning the people that we're not supposed to question. We're just supposed to do what they say. And I think that can then have, repercussions, that it takes a lot of bravery to do that kind of thing. And I think what Ramona was talking about as well in terms of the bias and research, and when she's talking to people about it, she's actually talking to people who are undertaking that research. And it's funny because I was thinking about, Michelle's question before Michelle asked it as well, like there's a danger there in what repercussions might come from the people who you're challenging. And I think decolonization more widely is definitely a form of challenging power structures, which comes under this sort of umbrella of sort of punk pedagogy, if you will, or just being punk and that frame of mind. But I think even in we're seeing more and more stories about, from a non-educational perspective, things in public libraries at the moment, like even things like public librarians striking, or things like the drag queen story times, and actually sort of taking a stand in communities where there is a lot of backlash to that. And so it's saying, no, we're here to represent these underrepresented voices, and we're willing to give this space to somebody who actually you might not agree with, but we're not here to censor that at all, and we're here to actually support that. So I think especially in certain areas that we've seen on the news in America, where that's taken a lot of bravery to just be able to stand up, and people are being sort of called for shutdowns or reduction in funding because of the approach and the attitude they're taking to supporting such initiatives. So I do think librarians doing things that are unexpected is sort of making tracks in social media a little bit from the public side at the minute as well.
Yeah, and I was really taken with thinking about that question and your answer just now with, I think a tweet that Yohanna, I don't think she's here anymore, but tweeted about how a lot of the stuff that's going on in libraries is people volunteering their time and their energy to do things at the moment. And I think that really fits in with that punk mindset about do it yourself. Like, yes, we're annoyed about this, or we think this is a problem, and we don't always feel that this sort of structures in the organizations we have in the profession get things done quick enough, or don't get things done thoroughly enough, or don't challenge enough sometimes, and maybe there's a bit of impatience in us, but it's like, no, I'm not happy with how this is working, so we're going to set something up ourselves and run this off. And that feels really punk to me as well, that do-it-yourself ethos.
Yeah, and I think especially when it's individuals who are sort of doing it without even the full buy-in of their manager. Like, okay, yeah, their manager said, yeah, you can do it, but their manager's not like involved actively in it and things like that, which I think you're right, that's very much sort of a DIY sort of thing, but also with that bravery of potential repercussions.
Yeah, and Ramona saying earlier that, you know, couldn't get things up and going with sort of the official sort of CASP sort of same stuff. So you make your own website, you do it anyway, and then you get loads of traction with it, which is fantastic. So we don't always have to work within the confines of what our profession wants us to do, and hopefully we can influence them. So yeah, and I totally agree. I think we are becoming more punk, or it's more visible anyway. That's really cool.
Yeah.
So later on, and I guess this links in with what you said there about managers' permission and managers' approval, but you talked later into your presentation about the challenge sometimes of maintaining that punk approach within an institution. Is that something that you're still experiencing in a new role? Is it better? Is it worse? How are you finding it in a different role in a different institution now?
So I would say that I'm probably challenging more things, partly because there might be certain things that I'm like, oh, you literally have no accessibility sort of procedures at all. And everything on all of our websites is appalling and failing all legal requirements. So we should probably do something about that. So that's an interesting one where I currently am. But I think one of the big things that I feel is that I feel like I'm able to challenge things more where I am now without that sort of fear of repercussions. And I've got a manager that is really appreciative of critical practice and taking on that kind of feedback, whether it's something about our immediate team or something more widely that's institutional. And where it's something bigger, she will sort of say, right, this is what's in our remit and what's in our control. Let's try and get the stuff that's not to the voices that we need to hear it. And actually, she's really good at that and then supporting that, rather than oh no, we don't want to hear about that, everything's fine sort of attitude. So I think that makes a really big difference. And I don't know whether it's definitely sort of a difference between like the type of institution. I don't know, because I know, you know, from hearing from other people, you know, there's lots of it about anywhere. I don't know whether you can necessarily draw patterns about the type of institution or any of that, really. I'm not sure.
Yeah, and sometimes it's just organizational culture. You know, what culture does that organization have? Does it impose lots of control and uniformity on things, or does it allow more experimentation, more changes? And I think you're right, it's not necessarily the type of institution or the size, it's about just what sort of culture have they developed in that institution.
Yeah.
So during the actual session itself at CALC, there was a question about whether to or to what extent you might explain punk pedagogy to students. We don't generally explain pedagogy to students. And you were going to reflect on whether you would share what pedagogy is to the students you're teaching. Have you had any more thoughts about that, about whether you do or whether you would?
So I still haven't necessarily explicitly sort of shared in educational terminology, but what I would say is I've probably been more explicit about maybe why I'm doing something. So why am I asking for feedback? How am I going to use it? Why am I introducing a specific activity? So why do I think it's beneficial for you to do this peer activity instead of me to just give individual feedback on what I think the search terms would be best to use? So I think it's more of an explanation around why I'm doing certain things from a pedagogical aspect, but without using pedagogical jargon that I know they won't understand. They probably, in most cases, wouldn't necessarily understand the word pedagogy.
Yeah,
so,
unless you're in it, yeah. It's almost like, yeah, wanting to explain the not just what do you want them to do, but why are you doing it in that particular way? What's the benefit of doing it?
Yeah, and I think the why is beneficial for loads of students for loads of different reasons. But I also think it's this kind of blurring the lines about stuff as well. It's just you being more authentic and honest rather than this sort of, you're going to do this because I'm telling you we're going to do this. Do you know what I mean? Like really giving them the reasons of why this is going to be beneficial and tying it into this, you know, this is what a formative is. This is why it's beneficial. This is what you're going to get out of it. So engage with it if you want to. You know, these are all the optional stuff. You don't have to do it, but this is why it's beneficial for you. You make that decision and that call now.
Yeah, and I think that's empowering for students as well, because you're being transparent, you're being open with them. So you always have a level of authority, but at least if you're explaining why you do something the way that you're doing it, you're being transparent about those choices that you make. Yeah. So last question I have on my list is, so you discussed punk as being about critiquing both from You discussed that punk is about critiquing both from students and staff. Have you seen a shift in student willingness to challenge the status quo of education sphere?
I think there's been a shift because of COVID and because of a lot of the sort of changes. And I think, you know, I've heard from some students, you know, viewpoints like, well, and this has come up a lot in accessibility perspectives, and I do a lot of other stuff about accessibility within sort of learning and teaching, as well as like this style of teaching. And in accessibility meetings, I've heard students say things like, you know, we were always told we couldn't have X accommodation. As soon as COVID came along, everyone got X accommodation, and now you're trying to tell us we can't have it anymore. So it'll be something like providing slides in advance, putting a recording on Moodle, doing something live or hybrid. So all of these things that students were being told, no, you can never have this. Then suddenly they had to do it, so they did it. It's like, well, obviously you could have done it then. So I think people, like students, do feel more confident to challenge things. And I think there's been a shift in, it's not just anonymous, like it's not just this, oh, you've been sent an anonymous feedback form, it's full of complaints, but actually even in like staff student committee meetings, I think there's a lot better dialogue. And again, I don't know whether that's the difference between the institution and whether that's sort of, there's that culture within the school I'm working in where students feel able to give that, but they will have proper conversations about, this is sort of what the sort of critique is about. This is why we're critiquing it, but also what I hear a lot is this is what would work better for me or for us, or this is what we'd like to happen if possible. And sometimes that's talking about quite big changes in the university. Sometimes it might be talking about very small specific things connected to a certain module. But I definitely feel that students come across, in my experience so far here, that they have a voice that is properly listened to. And I think maybe that actually feeling like you're listened to is what makes a difference, because if you feel like, oh, well, even if I say something no one's going to care, then why would you bother sort of challenging something? But if you feel that something actually is going to come of it and that your voice would be listened to, then maybe you're more likely to try and put that effort in.
Yeah, that's really, I wonder if any of that difference sometimes might be around having moved from working in an institution in England into Scotland, because I guess in England and Wales, the promise has been, oh, well, if you make students into consumers and you go down this neoliberal route where you say, oh, we're all students are consumers now, they'll demand more change. But it sounds as though, you know, some of your students, if they're Scottish, they're not paying fees. But they're still expressing their needs and what they want. It's showing up that you don't have to treat students as customers in order to actually, you know, get their needs from them, really.
Yeah, the vast majority of our students, so we have about, I'd say about 50% of our students are Edinburgh-based students, and then our next highest number would be international students. Who
I guess are paying still.
Yeah, who are paying, but yeah, like we do have like more than half of our student body is coming from a very local area, not even just widely over Scotland. So yeah.
Interesting. Okay, so we've got a few minutes left. If anyone does have any questions, Michelle, has there been any that have come in?
Nope, I haven't had any come in.
Okay. So if anyone does have any, do feel free to pop your hand up or pop it into the chat. I should probably say as well, in doing this whole sort of catch-up reflection thing that we've planned here, I think it occurred to me, Michelle, that maybe actually we could reflect a little bit on 3 years of doing CALC a little bit. So if anyone has any questions for us about having run CALC for 3 years now, and what our experience has been, feel free to ask those as well if you like.
I don't have a question, but I thought, Darren, I could end by telling the audience my exciting information. Oh,
please do.
Okay. Well, I was wondering how could I tell librarian people, because I didn't really want to say anything on Twitter. So as well as seeing me on your screen right now, if you watch ITV at 9:30 on Saturday, you will also see me appear on Who Wants to Be a Millionaire. So that's going to be exciting. I will reveal I'm not a millionaire, but you will see me in the hot seat.
I knew this, but it is really
yeah, Darren's fake surprise there.
I was thinking, what was it? I was like, oh yeah, that is news. You did tell me about that, but it is.
Yeah, and I do talk about punk with Jeremy Clarkson, so it's very topical.
Awesome. Right, well, now I'm scared that any questions that we do get through at this point will be related to that, rather than. Well, next time we do a catch up like this, make sure that when I give you a list of questions, I'll give you 4 options for each of them, and then you have to answer multiple choice rather than just top of your head. Right, okay, well, I don't think there's anything else coming in, so I think we're good to wrap up from there. So thank you so much, Maria. It's been really nice for just talking to you, but also catching up on your work since and what's been going on with you. I'm sure everyone else has found it really interesting, so please do share your thanks for Maria in the chat, everybody. I'm just going to switch back to my slides just to wrap up and finish our session for today. So yeah, I don't have 15 minutes worth of thank yous and goodbyes to say to everybody. Please put this in just to give everyone a chance. And just tell you a little bit more about what we've got planned for the future and what will happen with these sessions that we've done. So thank you all for attending, particularly for afternoon at this time of year. It's been really great to see so many people, and also lots of familiar names and people that I know have attended other CALC events. So it's really nice to know that we've got that community where people want to come along to stuff and hear again from speakers. As I said at the beginning, this is our 3rd and final session in our CALC summer series. So you won't hear from us again for a little while in terms of new events, but we are planning on running CALC in 2023. In order to help us to do that, that was a beautiful segue for me there, I think. There is a shameless beg for money, please, from yourselves or your institutions. What that will allow us to do is to pump prime a lot of the costs that we have for running CALC. So things like paying for keynote speakers, paying for consumables that we need, and starting to pay for things like catering if we do it face-to-face. It's really hard running a conference when you don't have another income stream, because everything is dependent on ticket sales, and if you don't sell tickets, then you can't pay your bills. So any pump priming funds that we get is really useful. So please do, if you are able to, yourselves or your institutions, to donate any money. That would be really, really appreciated. As I said, we are planning on looking at CALC in 2023. Venue is to be decided. We are thinking that we'd probably like to do something face-to-face, because we've had 3 years of a really great community meeting online, and it would be quite nice to also meet in person. But there's a whole load of decisions to be made about that, and we also need to see what the situation is going to be at that time. In terms of today's session and all the other CALC Summer Series ones, we have been recording these sessions, so we will be transcribing them and doing the closed captions. We do those manually because we think it's important, not just that things are closed captioned, but they're also done well and that they actually do reflect what was said on the day. So it does take us a couple of weeks to do that. 3 hours of transcribing takes at least 9 to 10 hours in practice to do, and we both work full time. So that should be ready hopefully in a couple of weeks' time. We'll publish it on our YouTube channel. If you want to get first dibs on that, you can subscribe to that YouTube channel. I'll also send out links to everybody who's signed up for today's session. If you were able to make it to some of the other summer series, the first session wasn't recorded because we were talking about our own workplaces, but you can see a few details of who was there. The second session was recorded and it's on our website. So you can find it on there along with recordings of both sessions that were on there. All the other sessions that we've been doing over the past couple of years at the conference, any that have been recorded, you can also find on the website. It's quite a big back catalogue of some really, really good content on there. So do feel free to indulge yourself in those. I think that's everything I had to say. Michelle, you've done our beg for money. And that's our link for that. Is there anything I've missed, Michelle?
No, I don't think so.
Excellent. Right. Well, finishing a whole 12 minutes early so that you can all get on and go home otherwise. Thank you very much for coming, everybody. We really look forward to seeing you at future CALC events. Thanks, everybody, and thank you particularly to all of our speakers today. You've been a pleasure to work with. Thanks.
Bye.
Thanks, Maria.